Microphones are coming around.
Sure. What we've heard is two very interesting points of view, one halachic, one non-halachic. And it's complicated. As Rabbi Tucker has illuminated, even halacha is a very complicated world. It goes from one end to the other end. What I see the real complication is this way that we're going to draw together both the halachic way of approaching who's a Jew and how and what that means for those borders that you spoke about before, whether that border be marriage or something else. And the non-halachic point of view, where the borders are a little bit more porous. How do we address that issue of communities that are sort of bathed within one point of view, or philosophical point of view, where one says blood matters, or heritage matters, and another one says that we can find other kind of alternative answers. It really belies the question, or underlines the question of where's the future of the Jewish
We have a question. Excellent. Thank you. Another question? There's a hand up over here. Go ahead.
I just wanted to speak to what Ms. Hennon said and sort of address the idea of what the immersion means to somebody. I'm a mixed heritage Jew, a Patrilineal Jew, and I went through a confirmation or affirmation or conversion, whatever you want to call it, fine, in order to attend school here at HAR. And I actually had an incredibly positive experience about it, although it was not something I ever would have anticipated doing until it was presented to me as an adult that I wasn't really considered halakhically Jewish. But one aspect that I think is worth drawing attention to is that part of that was changing my name in terms of my Hebrew name. And I was given a Hebrew name. I was raised in the Reform movement, so my name is Rachel Hannah, and I became Rachel Hannah Bat Azriel with my father, and basically leaving my mother out of the mix. And I could have chosen to take Abraham and Sarah, and I chose not to. I chose to stick with my father's name, but I think that speaks to something also that Andrew Simon brought up, this idea of giving up what came before, and is also something that, like you said, I'm very uncomfortable with because I also still will spend Christmas with my family, my Gentiles, and the family who I'm far closer with than I am the Jewish side of my family, wonderful, warm people, which I think any Gentiles in our family can attest to. So it's just something I think is worth exploring further.
Thank you for sharing that, and I will also say that actually many years after I had become a very observant Jew, I had my own affirmation ceremony, which was incredibly meaningful, and I thought of it as a naming because as a baby I never had a Jewish naming, but it was like a mikvah with witnesses, a lake. It was great. Totally loved it. So I recommend it to anyone, and one kind of great plug here is like, how do you know you're Jewish? Maybe it's somebody back in your family, your grandmother's grandmother isn't Jewish, or had a weird conversion. So if you have any doubts, take yourself to a lake with all your friends. It's funny. Take yourself to a lake. To the question of whether halachic and non-halachic folks can play nice, I think that that's really a question for each individual circumstance. I think for what purpose is always the question, and in some communities there are practices around, for example, in a community that mixes people who think they can, be yotzei on someone else's kiddush, and people who they think are not able to make them yotzei. That is, you could have someone say kiddush for you and you wouldn't have to say kiddush yourself, but there might be someone in your community who you don't think can do that because of their status. Then maybe the community needs a practice of everyone saying Kiddush all together, or everyone individually saying Kiddush, but not so that no one is put on the spot or embarrassed. If it's a question about Torah aliyot, that might be really hard. If somebody wants to have an aliyah to the Torah and the gabbai won't give it to them ever, that can be very hard on them for whatever reason. I mean, there are people who don't like to say traditional Torah brachot and end up in communities where that's the only thing that they can say, and they find themselves unable to have an aliyah, in their shul, in their home community. But I think that really the way to solve this problem is each instance at a time. And I really appreciate that the sessions we're having later are going to be in these different, schools, synagogues, etc. Because I think that is the answer.
So yeah, two different reflections on the points that were raised. I think one of of the difficult elements, most difficult elements about this conversation is sometimes, and I actually think this happens to all of us in different ways. This issue is a specific subset of the population, but it happens to us in all different ways. We think we're part of communities sometimes that we're actually not a part of. Sometimes we think we are in relationships with people that we're not actually in. This happens all the time. It happens in maybe peaks in high school, but then it continues through the rest of the life. And I do think actually it is quite serious that part of the difficult piece of working some of this through is coming to terms with the fact that some of the unpleasant pieces are actually navigating our own boundaries of who is important for us to be in community with. We deal with this on conversions and other issues all the time with the state of Israel, where when I counsel people who are thinking about getting married in this way or that way, or how do they deal with a conversion, I try to flip their language around this of saying, look, at the end of the day, to the extent that you're feeling that the state of Israel and its bureaucracy is leaning down on you in a way that's making you deny yourself and complicate your whole identity, all of which I may, in most of these cases, completely sign on with that person, you still have to understand that it's doing that because you are effectively saying that it's important to you that Israel, as an experience and a place where you could live, is a part of what you want your life to be about. You ultimately, at the end of the day, are the author of the communities that you stick yourself with and give power over yourself to. There's a way in which obviously people have power and they can abuse it, and I don't mean to play that down at all. But I think there also is a way in which, at the end of the day, we do kind of choose who we are in relationship with and who we tell to go take a hike. I think one of the things that is the great thing about the autonomous free open culture that we live in America is that at the end of the day, you basically have the right to tell anyone you want to take a hike. And to the extent that someone is boxing you in one way or another, there actually is some place that you can probably go to of recognizing that it's actually something that that person or that community is bringing to the table that is really important to you. The question is it important enough to take all the hits that you're going to take on other fronts to be a part of it? I don't think there's any way to avoid that messiness. The last thing I'll say in terms of sort of halachic, non-halachic, my own investment, not just on this issue, but more broadly, in terms of how we think about halakha and think about Jewish approaches to issues, is that ideally we should be narrowing to zero the gap between what we talk about halachic sources kind of demanding as a legal system on the one hand, and what seems like the right normative way to proceed in decision-making. Which is to say that the halachic tradition read in its fullest way and in its most obvious and its most sort of rich manifestation should be something that simultaneously is a lot more nuanced than we originally thought it was, and can say a lot more things to a lot more people than we might have thought, and also should be something that actually shapes and persuades us in certain ways, such that I would rather us not think about there being a halachic approach to this problem and a non-halachic approach to this problem, but rather that the normative sources of the Jewish tradition are themselves the earlier incarnations of us today asking this question. And when we ask this question, we look back to those sources and we cite them as precedent, it's because there is wisdom in there that should be shaping and guiding how we think about it in a way beyond just the preconceptions that we come to the table with. So I would hope that in the long run, the goal, as distant as it may seem, is can we actually create a shared language around addressing this issue? And a rich enough language has the capacity to say a number of different things at the same time. That doesn't mean it's going to happen at the end of this mini conference. But it does mean I think that's what we should be striving for, not to let people off the hook as saying, well, I'm pursuing this from a halachic lens, or I'm pursuing this from a non-halachic lens. We're actually Jews trying to figure out through the language of Torah what is the way to move forward on this issue. So that would be my